What do you think about when you hear the word goblin? Is it the mischievous little sprites that go spoil the porridge in some farmer's cottage off in the moors of Scotland? Or is it perhaps those cannon fodder ferocious enemies that you hack through in the beginning levels of the video game? Or is it that YouTuber who posts those fantasy news videos? What a goblin is not as clearly defined in modern sense as elves is. In modern, there's a lot more wiggle room of what a goblin could be as regards to an elf. And this is partly through its development through the years. I decided this time I was going to start with the definition of the word in the Webster's College Dictionary, because the words and where they come from helps gives a clear view of what word it is. And I bookmarked it so it'll be easier, but goblin. From Middle English, goblin. From Middle French, of the same kind. From Latin, of goblinius, ultimate. From the Greek, of koblos, for rogue. This dictionary gives the definition of the one way we can think of goblins, which is a ugly and grotesque spirit that is mischievous and sometimes evil and malicious. For in the beginning, that was what a goblin was. It was another word for a mischievous trickster. Goblins were kind of ugly, and I also found out in research that goblin actually had a female variant of goblinette. But those words would be used in replacement of for like imp or sprite, like a fey creature that steals babies and put changelings in. You could have a goblin child in fairy tales, or that would go mess up your porridge or could help you. The word is very also similar to the word hobgoblin, though hob and hobgoblin have a more positive connotation. Hobs were more helpful spirits, while goblins, for the most part, were more malignant. This kind of goblin is the one modern view of goblin, which I believe is Harry Potter. I haven't read the Harry Potter series yet. However, there is another meaning of what we think a goblin is that happened when a certain Oxford professor got his hands on the creature. And he's a person that'll keep showing up in this series of history of fantasy creatures, and that is J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, Tolkien's change, which I'll get to it in a moment, but first, it didn't come out of a vacuum. Tolkien was young. He loved the fairy tales of the author George MacDonald. And one of George MacDonald's more popular stories is The Princess and the Goblin, in which the goblins are ugly creatures that live in caves and have really big feet, and you step on the feet and it hurts them. That's their weakness. But before Tolkien, there was this thing of not exactly even like a mischievous or like a spirit that just goes plays tricks on houses. There's something more. And Tolkien took this and used this word in his Father Christmas letters, which is not something people might not know, but the Father Christmas letters was a series of letters he wrote to his children pretending to be Father Christmas, which was the British version of Santa Claus, at least back then. And it's a really fun story. They have it publicized the letters, and there's things about the great polar bear, which is another character, and then eventually they had goblins show up and they had to fight the mischievous goblins. And so going on, I think the word goblin Tolkien just used for antagonists in some of his stories he told his children. And that went on when he told the story The Hobbit, where the evil force were goblins. Now, we don't get that much information about goblins in The Hobbit, and I have Hobbit right here. I'm going to pull it out, because there's actually a line I want to read to you. It might take a while, so this will be a jump cut. Okay, I found it. This is in the chapter Queer Lodgings, when Gandalf takes leave of the dwarfs and Bilbo after they left Beorn's and they're going to go into Mirkwood. Bilbo asks, is there a way around Mirkwood? And then he says, you could go If you go north, you'd go to the slopes of the Grey Mountains. And they are stiff with goblins, hobgoblins, and orcs, the worst description. This is the updated version. Tolkien actually updated The Hobbit for some copyright disputes. So they might have edited that. He might have made a change there, though I'm not completely sure. Goblins, there is where you can start seeing the move of goblins transfer into the more vicious creatures, which is the other modern viewing. But most of that, less of it was done in this, and most of the transformation was taken in when J.R. Tolkien made The Lord of the Rings and replaced what was goblins in the first book, in The Hobbit, with orcs, which are much more vicious. And yeah, the goblins in The Hobbit were vicious and evil, and I think they're basically the same thing as orcs. And that's how I think we had the start of, okay, what's the difference between an orc and the goblin in the vicious sense, no longer talking about fairy tale. And they settled on having goblins be a mutative cousin or other relative of orcs, which would explain why they're both, why there's goblins in The Hobbit and orcs in The Lord of the Rings. And Peter Jackson ran with it in the Hobbit books, and in a way it fits in Tolkien's lore, because there's hierarchies, like the Uruk-hai are better orcs than the Mordor orcs, and then so goblins are just a weaker version of orcs. And so kind of with elves, what happened after Tolkien was people from like D&D and other role-playing games ran with it, because they had set it up, and it fell neatly into the spot of the lower level kind of monster that you could fight. And going on, I've seen some other changes. Goblins have, there's a kind of goblins that is a mixture of the two. It's almost a third kind. You have the mischievous or helpful spirit who would like mess up the porridge, or goblin lights, lead a traveler to drown in the swamps. And then you have the monster goblin who isn't that intelligent, with his stabby, cheap spear and cannon fodder for your fledgling adventurer. And they kind of melded together to have a more grounded, less fairy mystical goblin that also isn't exactly evil. And they're good with their hands, and they're smaller. I actually have, in my own story, I have a set of goblins who aren't necessarily evil at all, and they have huge ears, and they're green, and they really like playing with clocks or repairing things. And jump cut me from future. Case in point, different versions of goblins. And this is more of the third kind I was talking about. The more cuter, but more corporeal, not as much mystical or fairy-backed. This is a goblin my one sister crocheted. It's pretty good, and it clearly illustrates the purpose of my point a lot better than any picture I can find on the internet. As you see, this is the interesting thing, is when I say elf, you're probably going to see Legolas. With the word goblin, there's a lot more wiggle room. And that's kind of the beauty of fantasy, that not everything has to be realistic or follow the same. I do greatly appreciate when you keep in with the etymological roots of certain, I don't know if it's right, but it's like, keeps within the bounds. So like goblins that are like clockmakers, that works. And even they don't even have to be green. Most of the time I think goblins are green, but they can be different colors. And just have a shorter sized creature that's good with his hands, that's perfectly fine. But if you said goblins were like 7 foot tall and flew like flying squirrels and ran in trees, that would be an entirely different kind of thing. I would definitely use a different word for that. Well, there you have it, the history of goblins in a nutshell. Thank you for watching, and if you like this series, this is the second one, subscribe and then go back and watch the first one about elves. That one was really fun to record, and I'm really happy with that video. And also, if you want to know the origin of your favorite fantasy creature, Leave any suggestions for future videos in the comments. I have a couple ideas that I'm going to work on after some other videos, but I want to make this a good long-running series, and I'm open for any creature suggestions or sources to look at or anything. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.